Hello, everybody. Let's just give it another minute, okay? Before we start, Zainab.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this cold, chilly evening. I hope everyone's doing well. We will start this event with the recitation of Quran, followed by a land acknowledgement. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم. مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. I begin by acknowledging that Allah created humanity in and of this earth as her Khalifa, and this land that we're on has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. We can never work to end systematic and institutional violence if we do not center the narratives of indigenous folks in our collective decision-making for social justice and equity. As settlers in Turtle Island, we directly benefit from decolonization and genocide of the indigenous people of this land. In order to engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustices inflicted on the indigenous people of this land, it is imperative we constantly engage in acts of decolonization. Therefore, I would like to acknowledge that this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dishwood One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Miigwech. Before I pass the mic to the next speaker, we would like to go over some housekeeping rules for tonight. So firstly, please be respectful of this space. We invite your comments and questions, and we'll run a live Q&A session at the end of the seminar. You're welcome to write your questions either in the chat box or the Q&A box. Please contribute to the Q&A session with an open mind and heart. Use I statements. Consider the Q&A session a dialogue, not a debate. Actively listen. Lastly, a post-event survey will be emailed to all of you later today. It will take about 2 to 3 minutes, and it greatly helps us plan future programming and events. Now let's welcome the president of CCMW, Nina Karachi Khalid, to give her welcome remarks.
Thanks, Zainab. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another installment of CCMW's Muslim Women Scholars Series. For the past 39 years, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, or CCMW, has been on an important mission to affirm Canadian Muslim women's identities and to promote an understanding of our lived experiences through community engagement, through research, through influencing public policy, and through striving for positive change. One of CCMW's strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims, and to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women, and their families. This webinar is part of a series of public seminars focusing on the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars that are focused on different topics related to Muslim women. We're looking forward to continuing to present these seminars over the next year, inshallah. I'll now pass the baton over to Nushat Jaffrey, CCMW's fearless leader and our executive director. Thank you. Nushat, are you there?
I'm here. I can't get used to unmuting myself.
No problem.
So good evening, everyone. It's so nice to have you all here with us on this very strange and cold evening in Toronto, dark evening in Toronto. Our weather is warming up. I don't know what it's doing in other parts of Canada, but here we are together. So and it'll be a nice evening together. So let me introduce you to Sarah Shah. Sarah is a PhD candidate, PhD, and is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She's a research fellow at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the U of T and a research consultant for Canadian Muslim organizations such as ours, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. They are a lead researcher at the Muslims in Canada Data Initiative, and their research focuses on the intersections of religion, family, and gender relations, racialization, and immigration and mental health. So welcome, Sarah, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Nushat. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides prepared. Okay, I'm hoping that you can see that fine. Inshallah, khair.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Zainab. Thank you all for joining tonight. This is an honor and a privilege to be presenting. Before I begin, I know Zainab already did the land acknowledgement, and I very much appreciate that. I have here an image of the Wampum Belts covenant that she mentioned, the dish with one spoon. I would also like to acknowledge that I myself, as a settler on this land, who currently studies family well-being in relation to religion, as a graduate and a current employee of the university system, I feel the imperative to hold space and acknowledge that there has been intergenerational harm done to First Nations families by the government, by the religious institutions, and by the education and the university systems. A tradition that crosses both Indigenous and Muslim culture is the idea around intention setting or making niyat. And so I'd like to take a moment and share with you my intentions for tonight. One aspect of decolonizing my own work is to break down the barriers that make it difficult for the larger public to be able to access academic research or resources, information. And so the article that I'm going to be talking about tonight, I made it open access so anyone can download it for free. And I want to acknowledge and thank CCMW, especially CCMW's leadership, for organizing this series and for making tonight and these kinds of events possible. So what are we talking about tonight? I'm going to share a bit about the context and the background framing this study and the questions that I wanted to address, and also the methods, the research that I used to address those questions. And then I'll share the findings, which are really, that is the heart of tonight's talk. So let's get started. If you look at research that's been done on Muslims in immigrant contexts, a lot of the focus is on how Muslims engage with others outside of the family home. There's actually very limited research on immigrant Muslim family relations. From the very limited research that has been done, we do know that gendered expectations of who does what, those gendered expectations are at the heart of North American Muslim marital conflicts. In a report that was done by Musawa is a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. In this report, the Musawa scholars argue that gender fluid approaches to paid and unpaid work are vital to diasporic Muslim family well-being. So this understanding that both men and women can care, both men and women can provide. However, one persistent theme that emerges from the research on Muslim families in the diaspora is this understanding, or this assumption, I should say, this assumption of Islam and Muslim practice as a monolith, that Muslim religiosity would have the same impact on shaping individual behaviors. Now, we know that's not true. We know that each and every single Muslim has their own approach to Islam, given their own gender identity, class background, ethnic culture, and so on. And in the Canadian context, things like geography, what province do you live in? Or wave of immigration, what year did you arrive in? Those things can also have an impact on the ways that individuals practice or engage in religion. So let's talk more about Muslims in the Canadian context. Canada is home to the second fastest growing Muslim population worldwide. The first is Ireland. According to the last national survey, so the 2011 National Household Survey, that actually included religion. The 2016 wave of the census does not include religion. But according to the 2011 data, the population of Canadian Muslims was estimated at over 1 million. And this population is expected to increase by 183% between 2010 and 2020. This is a rate of growth that's 10 times that of the general Canadian population. So this is a very quickly booming population. The largest pool of Muslims entering Canada is from Pakistan, and Toronto is home to the largest population of Canadian Muslims and Canadian Pakistanis compared to other Canadian cities. You can see on this density map of the population across Toronto, or the Greater Toronto Area. And just by the way, if you'd like to see distributions of Canadian Muslims across Canada, there's a 2019 data report that I had authored that actually provides maps across Canada to show you where the populations are more densely populated. Back to the current context of looking at Muslims in Canada, general concerns about the Muslim population, or I should say about Muslim women in Canada, have peaked during the past 2 decades because of debates over Sharia-based arbitration, the Charter of Quebec values, and the niqab banning Bill 62 and now Bill 21. The rise of right-winged populism in the global north with undertones of Islamophobia, which sometimes are not so discreet, and the ongoing concern about honor killings. Despite this fixation on Muslim Canadians' gendered Muslimness, we don't know much about how race, gender, and religion intersect within the diasporic Muslim family household. Brubaker coined the term Muslim reflexivity to refer to the trend in research on immigrant Muslims that captures the critical engagement with Islam. Rather than taking Muslim identity for granted, and rather than taking Islam as a set of beliefs and practices and values without questioning it, Brubaker argues that both Islam and Muslim are critically assessed, especially within the immigrant Muslim family homes. And you hear this in our communities as well. When you hear parents say, oh, like children here ask so many questions, they don't just listen. And then they'll say children back in Pakistan or back in other Muslim majority countries, they don't ask questions. Brubaker also claims that the upshot of this critical assessment is that Islam would not be used as a medium or a vehicle for social and cultural practices. Now, if you've ever experienced being a Muslim woman in an immigrant family, you know that's not true. Our parents still try to use Islam to justify social and cultural practices. And studies document this, that immigrant children, especially daughters, draw on religious authority in order to resist parental pressure around social and cultural practices. So when is this upshot that Brubaker is talking about actually observed? In addition to that question, I engage in the following research questions. So first, how do Muslims engage with religion within their families? What roles do religious approach, beliefs, ideational norms, and religious practices play? What weight do religious practices and religious resources and religious approach, what weight do these aspects of religiosity have in relation to other social factors? How do experiences of gender and racial discrimination relate to Muslim religious experiences and engagement? How do experiences of discrimination relate to the way in which religion is utilized as a resource in marital dynamics and in family relations? How do different generations of migration or different religious approaches reinterpret or selectively retain religio-cultural norms? And third, and this question is sort of the crux of my entire career, how do religious approaches, which are related to experience of gender and racial discrimination, in turn shape family life? How does gender justice manifest in Canadian Muslim marriages? And under what conditions and in what contexts do marital dynamics and power relations reflect gender justice? This article that I am presenting tonight focuses on the first research question. However, I'm happy to speak to the other two questions as well, as they're all interconnected. Now, in order to understand the full meaning of these questions, it's important to use our sociological imagination. Pakistani-Canadian Muslim marriage represents the intersection of a few different social institutions of gender, of family, religion, race, and immigration. What does that mean? Sociologists see the social world as organized on three levels. There's the macro or the institutional, the meso or the group, and the micro or the individual. And this might be a bit confusing because especially if you haven't thought of the world in this way before, most people do see the world on a micro level at the individual level. But being able to see the world at all three levels allows us to understand how some of our personal troubles are actually social problems. So for example, I've spoken with Canadian Muslims who have a lot of trouble finding employment. And when they begin to notice that other Canadians don't have that same struggle, but other Canadian Muslims do, then they start to realize religion is institutionalized and they're experiencing religious-based discrimination. Their personal troubles are actually a social problem. So using the sociological imagination, we see that individuals interact with each other in relational or in group settings, and their interactions are structured by the norms, the ideals, and the ideologies of the institution. Drawing on this approach of seeing the social world to understand Pakistani-Canadian Muslim marriage, I conducted interviews with a sample of 23 couples and 10 previously married women. The analysis that I'm presenting tonight focuses just on the 23 married couples. I interviewed all of the wives, and a male interviewer spoke to their husbands in a separate space out of earshot. Interviews were conducted wherever and whenever participants felt most comfortable, and in whatever language they preferred. On average, interviews lasted about 2.5 hours. Some of them were like over 4 hours. Participants were asked for a life history with a focus on their natal and married family life, their paid and unpaid work, their experiences with religion, their immigration and discriminatory experiences, as well as their gendered attitudes and practices. In the first analysis, I coded transcripts using concepts from past research, which wasn't very helpful. And I also allowed for concepts that emerged while interviewing, transcribing, and open coding. And this is called in vivo concepts. In the second analysis, I applied Mill's method of agreement and difference. According to Mills, if two cases are very different, but share one similar characteristic and the same outcome, then that characteristic is related to the outcome. On the flip side, if two cases are very similar, but differ on one characteristic, and also have different outcomes, then that one characteristic is related to the different outcomes. I know that was probably difficult to follow. It'll become more clear with examples that I'm about to show you for the findings. And the findings indicate that religious approach matters. Before getting into that, I'll take a moment to quickly describe the identity negotiations that my participants engage in. All reflexive participants balanced religious, ethnic, and citizenship identities teasing out a sense of belonging, of how and where they fit into the world. Exclusivist reflexive Muslim participants held fast to their Muslim identity, but they distanced themselves away from their Pakistaniness. And although they don't outright reject their Canadian identity, they do narrate experiences of feeling like other Canadians rejected them, that they didn't feel accepted. And these experiences, they ranged from very violent experiences to even perceived microaggressions. Like, for example, one person was offered a handshake, and she felt that that handshake was an act of Islamophobia. Inclusivist reflexive Muslim participants, on the other hand, they pick and they choose what they like about being Pakistani, about being Muslim, and about being Canadian without categorically rejecting any of those identities. And while exclusivist reflexive Muslims perceive very bright boundaries, so very sharp differences between these different identities, inclusivist Muslims don't. These divergent characteristics relate to patterns around religiosity, the way that participants frame family life, how they narrate experiences of discrimination, their gender attitudes, and their practices. Tonight, we're focusing on the framing of family life. But before getting into that, I want to show you the difference in the lived realities and the perceptions of their social environments for these two approaches. This graphic illustrates the bifurcation, the split patterns in the worldviews. In the words of my participant, Umber, whose words are the title of this article that I'm sharing with you, inclusivist reflexive participants see shades of gray, while the same is black and white for exclusivist reflexive participants. While exclusivist reflexive Muslim participants see bright boundaries between correct Islam and cultural Islam, inclusivist reflexive Muslim participants do not. Exclusivist reflexive Muslim participants also see very bright boundaries between their Islam and their parents' Islam, between Pakistani and Canadian culture, and between men and women. They perceive interactions with others as reinforcing the brightness of those boundaries. Inclusivist reflexive Muslim participants do not. Okay, let's focus more specifically on how this manifests for a religious approach. Turning back to Umber, who's again coined the black and white or the shades of gray expression, here is the full quote of how she describes the way that religion shapes her life and vice versa. She says, I'm just going to take a sip of water before I read this. She says, I've changed in my Islamic perspective since we got married. I've become more concerned with how things operate at a human level rather than how they operate at a juristic level. My husband is very black and white. I'm very gray. And that's how we put it to each other. Those are the words that we use. He'll be like, well, you're my gray, because everything he says is a ruling. I've been exposed to so much education about Islam at this point that I can say, yeah, but the Shafi say this, or the Maliki say this. He's like, he calls me a fatwa queen because he says that, and you hear fatwa shopping in a derogatory sense. I don't shop for fatwas. I just know the differences. I put them on the table as an alternative, and he doesn't like alternatives. He likes black and white. Well, I have no problem with taking an alternative if there's a valid justification, which in my opinion is an Islamic thing to do. So here we see that the differences are between the inclusivists and the exclusivists. Inclusivists are more interested in how things operate on a human level. They accept multiple approaches or alternatives in religion as valid. Exclusivists are more interested in how things operate at a juristic level, and they see only one acceptable approach. There are additional differences in the approach that we can see based on participant narratives. So, for example, in how they define what it means to be a good Muslim. Generally, exclusivist reflexive Muslim participants focus their religious reflexivity on da'wat. This plays out as talking to non-Muslims about Islam and portraying like a good image. So basically, they're being good Muslims for the sake of non-Muslims. Inclusivist reflexive Muslim participants, on the other hand, they focus their reflexivity on akhlaq, or having good manners. As a practice, akhlaq plays out within the home, and for men especially, by focusing on gender relations. This is a separate article, but I'll share the details of it here as well, as it is related. I note that unlike exclusivist Muslim husbands, inclusivist Muslim husbands, in their interviews, they would share these mental processes of how they would critically try to assess if their wives were happy, if their desires were being fulfilled, if the husbands were doing all that they could to make sure that the wives were able to pursue whatever they wanted to. The exclusivist Muslim husbands, on the other hand, they seemed really bored when they were asked to talk about their wives or children. They were just not interested. Where they would take an interest was when they were asked to evaluate their wives' religiosity, and then they came to attention. And you'll see that in a few slides. For inclusivist husbands who deeply empathize with their wives, the marital experiences were completely different because they emphasize akhlaq, especially within the home. So, for example, Jafar, who is an inclusivist Muslim, he was asked what makes someone a good Muslim, and he says, your akhlaq. That's huge. You can pray, you can be the most, but if you lack basic etiquette and akhlaq, to me, you're not a good practicing Muslim. A good practicing Muslim is someone who will do his wajibat, will have the utmost respect for somebody, and will never ever cheat somebody in any way or form. You look at somebody, you see their actions, their humbleness. They don't look religious, but deep down, they are. For me, it's all about your actions and your akhlaq. I've always been more interested in that, how you respect others. It doesn't matter how much you pray or how much Quran you read. We do those things. We do what you do. We do what we have to do. But there's a difference between rookie religious and being religious, and akhlaq is the main determinant. For Jafar and for other inclusivist religious Muslims, akhlaq was the repeated feature of being a good Muslim. So good Muslimness is something that's deep down and it's on the inside. It's not a list of things that you can check off. It's not an outward visible practice. This contrasts with exclusivist Muslims. For exclusivist reflexive Muslims, religiosity was outwardly observed, not inward. And religiosity was evaluated through the primacy of prayer. Across narratives, exclusivist Muslims indicated that prayer is what makes someone a good Muslim. Like that's sort of the core. So for example, and this was regardless of how practicing they themselves are. So for example, Qahira is an exclusivist Muslim, but she doesn't frame herself as religious because she doesn't practice. She frames her husband as also not being religious because he doesn't pray. I found this confusing because earlier in her narrative, she was talking about how her husband would or wouldn't do certain things because of his religiosity, but then she framed him as not being religious. So I asked her to explain that. And she says, well, we eat halal, we eat zabiha. So yeah, religious in that way. I think we have like a lot of practicing stuff happening, but not praying. But for me, I'm like, oh, I'm not religious, so I don't care. But I think he actually thinks he is. So if he does all the other stuff, if he started praying, I would actually consider him quite religious. So, and again, this was consistent as a theme across exclusivist reflexive Muslim narratives. Some did positively evaluate their spouse's religiosity, but only if the spouse absolutely complied with the participants' criteria of religiosity and what it takes to be a good Muslim. Inclusivist participants positively evaluate their spouse's religiosity, regardless of if the spouse was actually practicing or not. So for example, Husna is very similar to Qahira in many ways. They share similar experiences growing up. They share a similar social location. So like their immigrant generation is similar. They both came to Canada as young children. They both have graduate degrees. They both even have similar political feminist beliefs and ideologies. Okay, so they're very similar. However, their religious approach is different. While Qahira considers her husband not religious because he doesn't pray, Husna, who is inclusivist, Husna considers her husband religious even though, and not only does he not pray, he actually doesn't know how to pray in the traditional salat or like the traditional namaz. And yet she frames herself as not being religious and frames him as being religious. When I asked her why, she said, well, some of the things he says are very Islamic. He tells me not to do some things because they're sins. Like if I was to tell a white lie here and there, he would say, don't tell them. Just the little things he's very aware of. He might identify it as karma or whatever, but it comes from religion. Not doing bad, not doing evil, forgiving, all those things I learned from Hassan. Those are the things I would say make me call him practicing. So he may not be practicing Islam. Karma is not necessarily a concept that comes from Islam, but Husna still frames Hassan as practicing because he practices akhlaq. Now you have an understanding of the differences between exclusivist and inclusivist approaches to religion and how these approaches differ when it comes to evaluating one's spouse's religiosity. How does this translate to conflicts? Well, in short, through male privilege. Marital conflict based on religion was a feature of marriages with exclusivist husbands only. Wives' religious approach does not matter because even when wives have an exclusivist approach, they don't have the ability to use religion to control their husband's behaviors or actions the way that husbands do to them. It was only exclusivist, reflexive Muslim husbands, not the inclusivists. It was just the exclusivists that would use religion to control their wives' behavior. So let's talk about actual cases here. We know Amber and Osman from the previous slides. Amber is an inclusivist, reflexive Muslim. Osman, her husband, is an exclusivist, reflexive husband Muslim. In their marriage, conflict is exacerbated by Osman's religious approach. So for example, Amber really wanted to buy a house, having experienced residential instability in her life. Osman, who didn't want to buy a house, referred to the haramness of the mortgage, even though he's quite comfortable paying interest on his credit cards. This contrasts with, for example, Nadia and Nabil, who are both inclusivists. I actually thought that there would be some form of religious-based conflict for Nadia and Nabil because, so I hadn't heard, Nabil was interviewed after Nadia. When I was talking to Nadia, she frames Nabil as being much more religious than herself and of him being traditionally religious at that. She mentions that he has helped her a great deal with her own religiosity. And so this sort of alerted me to this detail, given what other women had shared. And so I asked her if Nabil's religiosity had ever caused conflict between them. And she says, no, never. He's always been, I think he brought this up even when we were talking before we got married. Look, my mother and my sister wear hijab, but there's no pressure on you two. It would be lovely if you started, but I'm not. And he's never, ever pressured me. When I thought, okay, I should get married, one of the things was I wanted to marry someone more religious than me in terms of their practice. And he was. He was very regular with his prayers. He goes to masjid a lot more. In that sense, he's really been my partner. I started praying more regularly and I became more mindful over even small things like halal meat. I wasn't that careful before. Okay, where I could, I would. Otherwise, I was pretty easygoing. And then with him, I became more careful. And she actually, I cut this quote short. She goes on to talk about how she only consumes animal products that are halal and ethical now, as she's become more reflexively critical of her religious practices in her everyday life. On his part, Nabil very reluctantly acknowledges that he may have played a role, he may have had an impact on Nadia's religiosity, but he underplays it. He frames her religiosity as very similar to his own, and he avoids making any value judgment statements about her religiosity or even anyone else's religiosity. Again, this is in line with other inclusivist, reflexive Muslim husbands. These men respect their wives' religiosity. Let's contrast the experience of Nadia and Nabil with Faiza and Fahad. Now, remember, I mentioned exclusivist, reflexive Muslims focus on prayer as a central aspect of being a good Muslim. When Fahad is asked about Faiza's religiosity, he says, "We both work on her religiosity together. A lot of times I try waking her up for Fajr, but she stays sleeping. It's hard for me. Sometimes I just keep tapping her, wake up, wake up. I go back to sleep because I finished praying, and I try to wake her up, but she's still sleeping. It happens really often. I've been noticing it a lot more now. Before it was like I would wake her up and she'd get up. Now it's like a struggle to get her up. It's really hard because I come back from work and I come back late. I set my alarm and the alarm is beside her. So she'll turn it off and go back to sleep. And I'm like, you didn't let me get up. You didn't wake up yourself." And then he said something, but I wasn't able to make it out on the recording. So he continues. "So even if I sleep through the time for prayer, as soon as I open my eyes, I see that the sun is about to come up. Fajr is at 6:10. Say I wake up at 7. I'm like, oh crap. I'll get up right away and pray and go back to sleep. Whereas she'll wait till Zohar comes. She'll be up already and she won't pray until that time." And given the irritation in his voice when he was talking about this, the male interviewer asked him, "Does this bother you?" And Fahad very gravely said, "It does." Now, if Fahad really wanted to help Faiza wake up for Fajr, there are some things he could do. He could listen to her, figure out what the problem is, and then address that. Instead, he wants her to behave in a very particular way, according to the way that he thinks she should be behaving. Fahad frames Faiza's religiosity as being subpar to his, and he ignores the reality of her life. Faiza does the vast majority, if not all, of the unpaid labor, including waking up during the night to take care of their teething child. Now, I don't have kids. I've never taken care of a child overnight, but I can imagine if someone is awake all night taking care of a baby, they probably won't be very awake for Fajr. And according to Faiza, when she asks Fahad for help with childcare, Fahad shirks his responsibility by claiming that it's her religious obligation as a mother. When she responds by reminding him of his religious obligation to her and her children as a husband and father, including, for example, providing her a separate dwelling from his natal family, he responds by stating that interest on a mortgage is haram. And so you see that instead of using religion to smooth over this conflict, to use religion to heal the relationship, exclusivist Muslims almost weaponize religion and take shots at each other. However, gender is also in the mix. And so while Fahad's shots land, Faiza's do not. Faiza is not able to leverage religion and push for her own needs and her children's needs to be met. Both Faiza and Fahad describe this conflict as coming to a head over Faiza's ability to wake up for Fajr, but Faiza also includes additional lived realities that her life is shaped by Fahad's religious beliefs and practices, while Fahad remains focused on and irritated by the way that she prays Fajr. And it's important to note, Faiza does pray, just not when Fahad wants her to. And this reflects a trend amongst exclusivist, reflexive Muslim husbands that in pushing their wives to practice according to their own understandings of religion, of the way things should be, they neglect the needs of both their wives and their children. I'd like to provide one last comparison between couples to really drive home this point. And here I'll also sort of expose Mill's method in the way that I performed it. So the color coding indicates which couples are similar. Remember what I said about Mill's method, that if two cases are very different, but share one similar characteristic and the same outcome, then the characteristic is related to the outcome. And on the reverse side, if the two cases are very similar, but differ on one characteristic and differ on outcomes, then that one characteristic is related to the different outcomes. Now, just like Qahira and Husna were very similar, Jafar and Ghazanfar are also very similar. They come from the same city back home. They are both sectarian minorities. They belong to the same community, and they have traditionalist gender ideologies. And yet, because their religious approach is different, the way that they engage with their wives is very different. Now, remember, Jafar was the one that I quoted a few slides ago, who talked about akhlaq being the difference between rookie and real religiosity. When he's asked about his wife's religiosity, he says, her character is better than mine. Her akhlaq is better. She's the kind of person that you look at her and she's a very respectful person, a very humble person. To me, that is Islam. That's something I can learn from her. Okay. Whereas Ghazanfar patronizes Ghazal and even infantilizes her. He feels that her religiosity has greatly improved thanks to him. And this was a consistent theme across exclusivist, reflexive Muslim husbands. In terms of marital conflict, for Jamila, who's married to Jafar, she feels that her needs are met and her goals are being achieved. She feels supported. There was other tension in their home, but it wasn't related to religion and it wasn't related to their marriage. However, with Ghazal, she shares that something Ghazanfar has been trying to convince me of recently is to wear the Irani chadar, which is, the full body veil. And I say this from personal experience, that is really hard to wear and like keep on it. Yeah. So Ghazal said, it will be very hard for me to manage that with children. Again, those of you who are familiar with the Irani chadar, like you actually have to hold it with your hands. So if you're holding children, you can't hold both at the same time. Ghazal says that she started in Pakistan, but it was so hard in Pakistan. It wasn't so hard in Pakistan. You don't have jackets, you don't have multiple layers because of the cold weather. But even in Pakistan, I would fall down and the kids would fall. Now, both Ghazal and Ghazanfar describe their marriage as companionate, and neither claims to recall any marital conflict, even when I and the male interviewer asked them extensively. We probed extensively, and they had trouble recalling any incident of conflict between the two. Still, when describing her life transitions, Ghazal names numerous occasions where her interests, her goals, and even her needs were dismissed because, in short, Ghazanfar didn't think that she should feel or need those things given his religious beliefs or his beliefs of the way that the world should be. He married her when she was in university, and he was aware that she wanted to pursue a career. Nonetheless, he sabotaged her plans repeatedly until finally she gave up and she acquiesced to being a stay-at-home wife and mother. And this Ghazanfar frames as him helping Ghazal see the light. This contrasts with Jafar and Jamila. Jamila is studying in a field that Jafar had studied in and he switched out of because he didn't like the work environment. And even though he would prefer that she study something else, he still supports her unconditionally because that's what she wants to do. In Jamila's interview with me, it didn't seem like she was aware of the fact that Jafar wasn't okay with the field that she was studying. What she did communicate to me, though, was her feeling of being unconditionally supported. It was clear that she felt that she could do whatever she wanted so long as she had the support system in place, which, thanks to Jafar, she does. Now, I know I've only spoken to you about 5 couples here. Remember, I spoke to 23 couples in total. I actually hit saturation at 16, but I kept going because I was just so curious. According to the full data set, this pattern holds. There are people who are super similar in terms of their social locations, and yet their religious approaches were different. And so the way that they think about their spouse's religiosity, the way that they engage with their spouses, and the way that they fight with their spouses are all shaped by religious approach. Okay, now turning to next steps. There are next steps for this current analysis and also next steps for the larger project. I'll start with the current analysis. Good research always opens more questions than it answers. So for starters, how representative are these findings? My sample it was a convenient sample. It was a purposive sample. It's not representative of Toronto-based Canadian Pakistani Muslims, nor for Canadian Muslims more generally. To address representativeness, I'm actually working on a large-scale data project at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, and it's called the Muslims in Canada Data Initiative, and I'm happy to say CCMW is one of our partners. So in a few years, I will likely have the data necessary to answer this question. quantitative survey data would allow me to test the correlation between, so how connected or how related religious approach and marital conflict are to each other. And I could better approximate the strength of this relationship using a probability-based sample to make claims about the larger population. A second question is how generalizable these findings are. I spoke to only Pakistanis and their spouses, so I actually don't know what this would look like for other Muslims, especially those who are Black or Indigenous or converts. While the patterns that I found may be applicable for other racialized immigrant Muslim populations within non-Muslim majority societies, I'm reluctant to make claims about Indigenous, Black, or convert Muslim experiences. Instead, I hope to be able to collaborate with scholars who have insider knowledge of these communities, and we could investigate the contours of religiosity and marital conflict. Turning to the current and the larger project, the analyses that I just shared represents the first of 3 questions I had posed for this larger study. The second question is about power negotiations, and that's my next sub-project. In that analysis, I tease out how women's bargaining power is structured by household arrangements and how members of a couple may be completely unaware of their own and their spouse's power or lack thereof. The third question on gender justice draws on the first 2 analyses, but in my opinion, it remains incomplete. Empirically speaking, according to the data, it is complete, but I am not satisfied. I found that gender justice emerges in couples where, I mean, you could probably expect this, where husbands are inclusivist and where wives have structural change power. And I'm not going to get into that just in the interest of time. Any other combination of husband and wife results in obstacles to gender justice. And there were so few cases of couples who actually were experiencing gender justice. I was disheartened and I couldn't come to terms with that. In fact, I'm now studying psychotherapy so that I can provide direct counseling as I continue this line of work. So inshallah, there will be more positive findings that I can share in the future. Okay, I've talked for long enough, and now I want to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your reactions, your responses, your questions to this. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can, oh, I can't see you. This is not a Zoom call. Okay. So I'm not sure who's moderating the questions.
So Sarah, I'm going to be moderating the Q&A, and it'll be my pleasure to do so. Before we do that, because some of it went over my head a little bit, so if you could maybe explain exclusivist and inclusivist, the differences between the two. I think I understand it, but just one more time.
My pleasure. So exclusivist reflexive Muslims are those who only see one form of Islam as correct, and it's their own practice. If others agree with them, they're good Muslims. If they disagree, that's not okay. Like they don't accept that. Inclusivist reflexive Muslims, they actually accept multiple approaches, not just to Islam, but religion, ways of life more generally. They don't judge or reject others.
Okay, great. So we can start with questions, and please do put your questions in the Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So just type in your question. So the first question we have, Sarah, is you mentioned that there was a male interviewer. Could you talk about your decision-making process regarding who would interview the participants?
Mm-hmm. So this actually comes out of my experience at the master's level. I was conducting interviews for a professor on, well, I won't talk about it, but I was conducting interviews and I had not so great experiences with 2 of my male interviewers, and it was 2 of my male interviewees, and that was back to back. And I spoke to my professor about it, and I told her, like, I don't feel comfortable interviewing men anymore because they get inappropriate. And she said, well, hire a male interviewer then. So for my dissertation, I decided to go through with having a male interviewer speak to the men And this, as a methodological decision, it also allowed me to ensure that men would also participate who were perhaps uncomfortable with speaking to a woman alone because of Sharia laws around mahram, non-mahram. And so I found that in a few of the interviews that the men shared the fact that they were more comfortable participating because of the fact that they were talking to a man and not a woman.
Okay, that's good. And then the next question is, can you share a bit more about why you decided to study psychotherapy? Good question. How will this shape your research?
For sure. So my study of psychotherapy is not for like a theoretical background, it's actually for practice. So I'm specifically studying relational psychotherapy in order to heal relationships within families, within communities. It's actually becoming wider, the scope of the work that I want to do. So the decision really, it came down to the fact that I had multiple women ask me for help. And I could see like the fault lines in their marriages. I could see what was wrong. And I couldn't say anything to them because sociologists don't do that. But this haunted me. And so I decided I had to do something about it, and I couldn't just sit by and allow it to happen. So I decided, actually, while I was writing my dissertation, to go back to school and study psychotherapy. And I'm so glad I did, because it keeps reemerging as a necessary service within the Canadian Muslim population.
That's good. How far are you from getting your license?
2.5 years, but I can start to see clients next September.
Wow. Okay, keep that in mind, everybody. Sarah will be able to take clients next year. Okay, so we have another question here. Does family or upbringing usually influence these young couples' social perspectives? As a Pakistani Muslim myself, I know that culture, not religion, impacts many practices, but Quran and Hadith are used as tools to justify.
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question. One of the really like nifty aspects of my data set, like my sample, is that I had people who are connected, including siblings. So I was able to get more than one account of the natal households. And what I ended up finding is that exclusivist and inclusivist reflexive Muslim. Oh, can you still
No,
see me?
your picture disappeared. You disappeared from the video.
Should I turn it back on?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, so it says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it. Oh, there we go. Got it.
All right.
Okay. So inclusivist reflexive Muslims, the way that they frame their parents is with a lot of love, with a lot of empathy. They frame, even if they don't get along with their parents anymore. For example, I have Husna, who I spoke about in this this talk. She does not speak to her parents. They're not on good terms. And yet when she remembers the experience of immigrating with her parents, with tears in her eyes, she recounted how her father had to steal bread in order to feed the family, that's how desperate he was. That contrasts with exclusivist reflexive Muslims who are very they're aware of their own suffering, and they're not so aware of their parents. They will often judge their parents' religiosity as cultural, not religious. Whereas for inclusivists, they judge their parents' religiosity as it just is. They're Muslim. They don't judge them harshly, similar to how they treat their spouses as well. So it is very much likely that the household is impacting the individual's social perceptions and their social realities, but there is a double effect happening where their current worldviews, whether they're inclusivists or exclusivists, those will frame their memories of their childhood as well. I mentioned having sibling sets. I had a sibling set of an inclusivist and an exclusivist participant. They were siblings, grew up in the same household, but their recollections of their parents are vastly different.
So Sarah, that's really interesting. Do you see any correlation between that, the fact that their experiences were so different?
A correlation in what sense?
So the fact that, the exclusivist had a certain view of the parents and the inclusivist, reflexive had a different view.
Mhm.
Does that have anything to do with how they perceive or their recollections of their parents?
Yes, yes. So thank you for asking that. I just realized I said it in my head, but not out loud. So inclusivist Muslims will remember their parents as being very supportive. They frame certain memories as like, this is how my parents made sure that I was well and I could succeed in life. Exclusivist participants will frame the same experiences as my parents were constricting me or controlling me, or I felt like I couldn't express myself. Like they perceive parental support as control, whereas inclusivist participants will perceive the parental support as support.
Hmm. And did that occur in a lot of your interviews? Because did you have a specific question about their parents and their bringing?
So it was a general life history that I asked. So starting from like, where were you born? All the way up to like, what are you doing right now? So it covered their entire life. As I mentioned, the interviews on average were about 2.5 hours. Some of them were well over 4 hours. So there were very, very detailed reports of these individuals' lives. We got into every nitty-gritty detail that we could.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is, what thoughts might you have for how faith is taught in our mosques, where many couples may go for mediation, counseling, or guidance before or after marriage?
This is a tough question to answer. I will say that in many masjids, consistently, Muslim men are privileged and prioritized above Muslim women and children. And so when these couples do go to Muslim spaces seeking help or support for their marriage, for their family, it's oftentimes that the man's perspective or the man's whatever is prioritized above the women and the children. There's also this culture of, or this expectation that women should sacrifice, that in order to be a good woman, that you should sacrifice. That it was actually one of the themes that consistently came up when people talked about things that they didn't like about Pakistani culture. The sexism against women was something that was very much repeated. So it would be difficult to access support from mainstream Muslim spaces that don't really see women's needs as like valid. I will say though that there are scholars and religious leaders who do acknowledge women's needs and children's needs as well. So actually, someone who just passed away, Marital, he was a pretty big leader in the American. I'm American, by the way. In the American tri-state context, I remember growing up, I heard someone refer to him as like, oh, like that's the woman's Maulana. And I never quite understood what that meant until I started to meet other scholars and I realized how dismissive they were. Whereas Maulana was never dismissive. He was always listening. He always provided space. So in a mainstream context, if you can find a person like him, that's great. Otherwise, it's tricky to navigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question here. Aren't categorizations like these, particularly when imposed by a researcher and not self-ascribed by participants, drawing hard sanitized or sanitized lines or science? I'm not sure exactly how to read that word. Lines within the multiplicitous and fluid realm of human behavior. Isn't this then inherently reductive and
Yeah, I absolutely agree that these categories are imposed in order to create contrast, in order for you, the audience, to kind of follow along with like the narrative that I'm sharing. In the article, I do make clear that although I'm presenting these as discrete categories, that it's actually more appropriate to think of it as a continuum. So for example, Umber started off as more exclusivist, became more inclusivist over time. The same is true for Husna. She started off as more exclusivist, she became more inclusivist over time. There are a few others who had the flip, where they would start off inclusivist and became exclusivist over time.
Okay, very good. So there's sort of like a follow-up question here. Did you find a difference between first, second, and third generation Muslim couples regarding the exclusivity and inclusivity of religion?
No, actually, so when I was speaking, I mentioned that I had a priori codes that were based on past research and like they were useless. And in fact, I'll respond to the previous question as well about superimposing these categories. I made the same mistake that I began this talk with critiquing of like the monolithic approach to Islam. That scholars would assume that religiosity would impact all Muslims the same way. I did that too. When I was looking at the data, so I think I was up to couple number 12, and I actually started to feel a little nervous because I was not finding the immigrant generational or the gender differences that the literature told me that I should be seeing. And when I mapped the data, the thing that emerged on its own, I wasn't looking for it. Religious approach emerged. The first thing that I noticed was the very harshness of the judgments about other people's religiosity versus the openness and the acceptance of other people's religiosity. And so I followed that down and I saw all of these bifurcating patterns around culture, around religion, around experiences of Islamophobic discrimination, around how people engage with their parents, around how people engage with their spouses, with their children. Yeah,
So then the categorization was based on what you saw in the results of your research.
Yeah, I'll actually share. This is completely innovative. No one has looked at religious approach this way before, and yeah, so this is path breaking basically. I don't mean to like tap my own shoulder, but like it is.
Very interesting. So there's another question here. I know you mentioned earlier women who were not married. Have you begun that research? Can you share any more on that? What is their take?
Mm-hmm. So specifically women who were previously married, and that's a completely separate analysis. But from that, I found that the women who were reflexive, 8 of the 10 women that I spoke to were reflexive. All of them were inclusivist. And their reflexivity, their critical engagement of Islam, it actually came out of their experience of divorce and seeing the fact that their needs were just dismissed. Their experiences were so terrible in mainstream Muslim communities that they became more critical of like, why are you treating me this way? Divorce is permissible in Islam, but you're treating me like a social pariah. Why is this the case? And that actually opened up their critical engagement with Islam, and they became aware of their rights as women in Islam, as wives. And they actually began to take pride in being Muslim and rejecting the forms of patriarchal Islam that were sort of being shoved at them.
So this, can you describe where the participants were, like geographically? Were they all over the GTA? Were they all over the country? Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that? Because I am curious about the previously married women who were now divorced and where they were situated, and the married couples too.
For sure. So I stuck to the Greater Toronto area because these interviews were pre-COVID, so they were actually in person. And most of the divorced women, except for one, was also located in the GTA. There was one that I had to travel a little bit to meet, but it was still it was close to the GTA. It was drivable.
Okay, so they were all local.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious where they were. Actually, so here's a question related to that. I'm curious whether interviewees mentioned the setting in the GTA that directly influences as it directly influencing their marriage, whether positive or negative. So being in the GTA and what that had to do with their marriages, positive or negative.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The only time that I can remember like location playing a role like that was there was a Shia participant who he and his wife were both Shia. He grew up in the West End of Toronto, and she grew up in the East End. And I found this interesting actually, because he said that her experience was like of these friendly Sunnis that were very accepting of Shia minorities. But he described his experience as being in the Wahhabi West, where the Sunnis sort of like rejected him. And the way that I saw that play out in their marriage, whereas he was an inclusivist, but he became exclusivist when it came to Shia-based practices.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually it wasn't his marriage that it played out in, it was his children. So across the board, he had this ideology of gender equality, that men and women are equal. Men and women should do the same thing. Men and women should be given the same opportunities, etc. But then somehow the conversation turned to Mutta.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentioned that he was teaching his sons about it. And the interviewer asked, well, are you teaching your daughters as well? And he said, no. And the interviewer asked, like, why not? You know, equal is equal. If you're teaching your sons, shouldn't you teach your daughters as well? And they got into this whole theological debate. But in that one instance, I saw him kind of express his exclusivity, this gender ideology aligned with exclusivity that was uncharacteristic of how he was otherwise. So that was one instance where geography did play a role and it impacted family relations. I can't say that it came up in interviews outside of this. But I will say that might be a methodological artifact. It might be the fact that because we didn't ask about that specifically, it didn't emerge in the data.
Okay. And in your study, were the participants, the couples, both Pakistani, or were they in some cases mixed? I would be curious to know about that.
Mm-hmm. In almost all couples, they were both Pakistani.
Mm-hmm.
In a few couples, they were not. So some Pakistanis, okay, so in order to participate in the study, one person in the couple had to identify as Pakistani. I allowed for there to be a non-Pakistani spouse for the sake of diversifying my sample. And I'm glad I did, because I found that the findings that emerged were not specific to Pakistanis. They applied to the non-Pakistanis as well. So Amber, for example, is a white convert. There were a few Bangladeshis, a few Indians. There was someone who was Turkish. But yeah, the majority were Pakistanis.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is building off the question about these categorizations of human behavior. Even if on a spectrum, what do you make of the fact that participants of your research might not agree with how they've been categorized and characterized? What are the ethics involved in this discrepancy between researcher and researched? And she goes on to say, note, I myself am a researcher on Islam and currently doing fieldwork, grappling with the ethics of fieldwork.
Mm-hmm. So I actually had participants read my dissertation, not all of them, just the ones that were interested and wanted to know. And I incorporated their feedback into my analyses. So for example, there was a participant who was exclusivist, and she felt that my portrayal of exclusivist Muslims was a bit unfair. And I took that into consideration, and I actually went in and rewrote sections of my paper to show that it's not exclusive religious approaches aren't negative in and of themselves. They do have negative consequences within the Muslim family, though. I didn't share it in this analysis here because it wasn't directly related. But I will say that when it comes to experiences of racial discrimination, inclusivist Muslims seem to be completely unaware. They don't know what's happening to them. But exclusivist reflexive Muslims are acutely aware of when they experience discrimination, and they're able to name it. So they have a sense of consciousness, of awareness of their social settings.
Interesting. Okay. So to what extent do you think the answers are affected by the 5 big personality traits, namely agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, etc., which often shape our political stances?
I'm a sociologist. I'm not really familiar with those kinds of like pop psychology like theories, so I actually can't answer that question.
Okay, sorry, Susan. You may want to add something in the chat box about that yourself, Susan, if you'd like. We can go on to the next question. Okay. Let's see. any correlation with socioeconomic status or educational level of couples. So the more wealthy or educated a couple would be, more exclusivist. Could you explain?
I did look for this, and let me tell you, like every sociologist that I've talked to about this project is boggled by the fact that it seems that religious approach is independent of social factors. I had participants ranging from speaking specifically about inclusivist reflexive Muslims, I had participants ranging from individuals who didn't have a high school diploma. They had a GED, all the way to people who were in graduate school and had a lot of social capital and a lot of economic capital. There wasn't as much variation for exclusivist reflexive Muslims, but again, the same thing. There were those who were struggling, and there were those who were very privileged. I will say this sample, again, it was a purposive sample. It's not representative. So I'll be able to better respond to the correlates of religious approach once I have quantitative data that I'm able to like test across the population and be able to establish those correlations. The idea of correlation, it lends itself to quantitative analysis. For qualitative analysis, you're focused more on like the meaning making or the processes that people engage in.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is, I echo the questions raised about ethics. It seems to me that inclusivity and exclusivity can be identified within the same individual. What are the benefits of claiming people as exclusivist and inclusivist?
So as a researcher, I'm not looking for like costs or benefits. I'm just looking at the data. And yes, there are examples of inclusivity emerging for people who are exclusivist or vice versa. And I note that in like the actual, the writing of the analysis. Again, when I presented to you just now, I was limited to 45 minutes to present something that's very, very, the nuance and the details are missed, are glossed over in a presentation this short. I spoke to 23 couples. I only talked to you about 5. And even that, I gave you little snippets of each. So yes, there is a lot more wealth and nuance in the details, which you're welcome to read in my work, but I didn't speak them during this talk.
Okay, and actually we'll ask Zainab, I think you have the link to the article. So you could provide the link in the chat if you don't mind. Zainab, that would be good because there's a lot more detail there. Absolutely. Sarah does not do justice for a 45-minute talk.
No.
So I'm wondering if there are any more questions, comments. People are thanking you, Sarah, for a great presentation, an interesting presentation, fascinating. I found it really, really interesting myself because, you know, I've seen. So I'm going to use your first, you know, person's black and white and shades of gray. I see that. Like I see that a lot in people where I can't see them only as exclusivists or inclusivists, because sometimes they'll be very dogmatic about certain things, but very, you know, open about other things, the same person. So I'm wondering if that's what you found as well, even though you were able to categorize them in this way.
Mm-hmm. So yes, this goes back to like the nuance. So I'll go back to the example of Omid, the Shia reflexive participant that I mentioned. When it came to his identity of being Muslim generally, he was inclusivist. But when it came to his identity of being Shia, he was exclusivist. Both identities are religious identities, and yet they manifest in these very different ways. So for sure, there was so much more nuance than what I was able to present. And there is this sort of like, I don't want to call it slippage because it's not slippage. It's it's specific to the individual, and it makes sense to their lived and social realities.
That's true. I guess, you know, human beings are very complex, and when it comes to their religiosity or their practice of religion, it's probably equally complex, and how they negotiate their religiosity and how much of it is, you know, deep, coming out of their, you know, their deep spirituality versus how much of it is performative. We don't know, we cannot judge. But it's interesting because I've seen some people become very, very agitated, for instance, if they don't say, a prayer right on time. You were describing that couple, where the woman would get up for Fajr and how annoying the husband found it to be. Whereas she said, oh, well, she'll pray, at Zohar. So that's really, really interesting. And I don't know if you found that, like, if it's almost like those kinds of things can be points of conflict, and they can, you said about the women who were previously married, those very fundamental things can cause the conflict.
Absolutely. But only for marriages where there is an exclusivist, reflexive Muslim husband.
Interesting.
Yeah, not the inclusivists.
Very interesting. All right, so I don't know if there are any more questions. I don't see any more. So Sarah's research is ongoing, and you did tell us what your next steps are. So we welcome you back when you have done more research and expanded more on your representativeness and generalization or not, or generalized, findings. So when you have more to share with us, we will welcome you back. And I just want to tell everybody that Sarah did a major piece of work for us, looking at the socio-demographic, socioeconomic, and health outcomes for Canadian Muslim women and girls, but particular populations of Muslim women and girls and non-binary people. So she looked at low-income women, single moms. She looked at Black Muslim women. She looked at queer Muslim women. She looked at, I can't remember all of the categories.
Muslim women with diverse abilities.
That's right. Yes. Women with diverse abilities. So you'll get a very different portrait of women in those categories. She has lots of quantitative data based on existing sources, but then she has a lot of very good qualitative data from the interviews or focus groups that she did. So we're going to be releasing that report. Sarah will be presenting her research on January the 22nd. So watch for information in our emails or in your emails. If you do not subscribe to our newsletter, we encourage you to go to our website, ccmw.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and you will hear about these the seminars, as well as other events where we share interesting and hopefully thoughtful or thought-provoking material about Canadian Muslim women and girls. Any other thoughts before I close? Anyone else with questions, comments? Lots of great feedback for you, Sarah, in the chat. So thank you again for your very, very interesting and really intriguing presentation. Like, I have lots more questions. I could probably have you sit down and talk to you for hours now because I have more questions. but
Let's
I
have coffee.
Yes, absolutely. So thanks again. And I'm now going to pass it over to Nina to offer some closing remarks and closing dua.
Actually, I think it's Miriam's turn right now.
Oh, sorry, Mariam.
No problem.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak tonight. And thank you everyone who attended for coming out tonight. Great questions. This was such a pleasure.
No, thank you, Sarah. Thank you everyone for attending the event today. And we just want to thank you for supporting us, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. And we want to thank you as well for supporting the Leila Fallman Scholarship Campaign, specifically that we've been having for the last month and a bit now. So we're very grateful for your help in supporting Canadian Muslim women and pursuing their education. So as you know now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, now probably going into the fourth wave, we've made a disproportionate impact on racialized women and families. So now with the Leila Fallman Scholarship Fund, we are able to support women who need our support to continue their education. So with your support, we're asking you to have this program survive so that the most vulnerable women and girls have the supports they can through this crisis and have the resources to rebuild their lives in the months ahead. So as you can see with Sarah's research, we want to support women that can provide this kind of research in the future. So with scholarships and bursaries, many women can afford to complete their education, which can then provide them with a better future for themselves and their families. So please, if you still can make a donation, please go ahead to our website at ccmw.com. Inshallah, actually in the future, we're planning to do as well another fundraising campaign specifically to Afghan newcomers, inshallah, in January. So please, watch out for our newsletters and any other emails that you'll receive from us. So thank you again. Salam, everyone.
Thank you, Miriam. Thanks very much. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. The following is a dua or prayer that is compiled by a few of my CCMW sisters, including our esteemed speaker, Dr. Sarah Shah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. The All-Merciful taught humankind the Quran out of mercy. O Allah, we express our deepest gratitude to you, alhamdulillah, for blessing us with the Quran, a guide for all believers. O Allah, fill our hearts with love for one another and sisterhood. Allow us to always empower, celebrate, and support one another with compassion and empathy. O Allah, please fill our hearts with love for you and allow us to open our eyes and ears to your mercy. Allow us to cleanse our hearts of bad intentions and to do everything in our lives with the intention to worship you, O Allah. O Allah, help us remove from our hearts attachments to ways of thinking and being that don't serve all of humanity. O Allah, strengthen our faith and our conviction so we may act every day and every moment in accordance with the knowledge that we receive. Help us to integrate this knowledge so that we can transform into better reflections of your most beautiful attributes. Only you do we worship, and only you do we ask for help. Guide us on the path of illumination and discovery, not the path of those who are consumed by anger, nor the path of those who have wandered astray. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربي صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد. Ameen. Thank you, everybody. I wish you all the best, and inshallah, we'll see each other again soon. Assalamu alaikum.